Okay. We've actually come to the end of our journey, 5 extensive days. I hope that it was absolutely worth your while. I want to start by reflecting a bit on what I basically presented to you as histories of planning, particularly in light of Kieran's sort of global sweep that basically put all of this in the larger context of what's going on in the study of planning history elsewhere. As I mentioned to you in my first lecture, the teaching of planning history is usually circumscribed with a careful policing, I would argue, of spatio-temporal boundaries. In many schools, in fact, the origin or the original moment, if you will, of planning is usually designated as the rationality or the rationalization or the rationalism of the late 19th century, and in a sense, the progressive attempts that occurred in the 20th century. And of course, as you all know, this is a moment that is completely located in the Euro-American context and not at all one that has anything to do with what we do or how we may view it in the third world. Can I, by the way, get the slide off, this one in the middle? Yes, the one in the middle that is just running exactly to my screen. Now, I say that because, you know, I think it is also important to recognize that, and parts of the Middle East, that many of them perfected their rationalizations of space in this frontier of colonialism is something that is rarely taught and rarely included. What I tried to do was to do the exact opposite here, is to make this a very conscious component of what we do. And this actually stemmed from my conviction that the colonial present is not simply a present beyond or elsewhere, but that it's always also here, in the intimacy, if you will, of the homeland. Or as Dolores Hayden argued, in order to imagine a public realm, it is necessary to first acknowledge the cycles of territorial loss and displacement that have been suffered by various racial and ethnic groups designated as others. Colonialism for us then was not simply a historical phase and cannot just simply be looked upon as a historical phase. It is also an analytical framework for understanding space and power. So when you hear the term post-colonial or someone actually using the term post-colonial, don't assume that it just simply means after colonial. No, it is something that allows you to configure how is it that the heritage of colonialism has left a mark on what we do as human beings, but for us specifically, and what we do as planners in terms of our underlying assumptions. Second, I think planning history, when conceptualized as a liberal and progressive practice located in the Euro-American context, as I have also shown you, maintains the narrative of a degree of Western superiority and uniqueness. So if you look at, you know, many of the examples of great success that we supposedly showed, they are still very much lodged within that Western context. I think the approach that I tried to advocate here was to tell the history of planning in the context of the evolution of a world system through the interaction between the East and the non-West, if you will, the West and the non-West, through which modernism and modernity were crafted mainly in the 19th century and the 20th century. This is precisely what post-colonial theory in general has made possible for us, the capacity for us to sort of see this. So again, building on all of the stuff that Kieran discussed this morning, what do we see then as the scope of planning for us that is included in this planning history? The question that is often asked about what constitutes the unit of planning action is that it's the immediate neighborhood or it's the region to which we should express allegiance, or should we be involved with what is beyond it? In many ways, I think the question operates through a false dualism, because the beyond can be also located, if you will, in the immediate. A local neighborhood, for example, in California, must be framed in terms of global terms of what it impacts and how it is impacted way beyond California. It's evidently, and this may not necessarily apply to everywhere, but I would definitely say that in India that is definitely happening as well, a globalized space from the flows of migration to the outsourcing of jobs to the export industry, or to the import industry, depending on where this particular city may fit in the challenge. The challenge then is how planners can work at the local level without being trapped by localisms which I actually think something that is very important for you guys here in Amritsar, and parochialism, how they can strategically work with the global linkages that constitute their arenas of action today, because they cannot necessarily ignore it. Now, this is actually a sign that I found in New York City, and it's very interesting. It sort of speaks with, or speaks of, how we are in the United States completely lodged in that. So one of the things that I want to do is talk about the impact of neoliberalism in this era of globalization and the resulting urban environment and what planners can do within it. This allows us also to flesh out a bit more the role of planning, if any, in this new climate. Imagine if the people of the Soviet Union had, for example, never heard of communism, the ideology that dominated their life for 70 years. The ideology that dominates our life in much of the third world and much of the Western world has now has no specific recognizable name. Mention it or not, most people would not necessarily know what you're talking about when you say that. So what is this neoliberalism? I'm sure many of you have studied it, but I'm going to go into it a little bit. Neoliberalism refers primarily to the 20th century resurgence of the 19th century's ideas that were associated with the laissez-faire economic liberalism. These include extensive economic liberalization policies such as privatization, fiscal austerity, deregulation, free trade, reduction in government spending, in order to enhance the role of the private sector and to allow a free market economy to thrive. The implementation of many of these neoliberal policies and the acceptance of the neoliberal economic theories of the 1970s are seen by some academics as the root of what they consider the financialization of the economy and the cycles of crisis that have occurred. You know, the financial meltdowns that have occurred, the collapse of public health, the collapse of public education, the resurgence of urban poverty, the rise of Donald Trump, so on and so forth. So where does this neoliberalism actually come from? Are we talking about a new kind of liberalism? And what is that old liberalism that had existed? Liberalism is actually a political philosophy, a worldwide view that was founded on the ideas of liberty and equality, whereas classical liberalism emphasized, if you will, the role of liberty. Social liberalism stresses the importance of equality. Liberals espouse a wide array of views depending on their understanding of these principles, but generally they support programs such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, free markets, civil rights, secular governments, and gender equality. Now, again, you cannot necessarily see this completely independent of the sort of the liberal schools of economics, which have become famous in Europe with Adam Smith in the 1770s, 1776 specifically, and with the famous book which is called The Wealth of Nations. He and others advocated the end of government intervention in economic matters. No restrictions on manufacturing, he argued, no barriers to commerce, no tariffs. Free trade for him was the best way a nation's economy can develop. Such ideas were liberal in a sense of no control. It's very important for us to recognize that, because liberalism, neoliberalism, while they have lineages, are often used in a very abusive manner. So this application of individualism encouraged free enterprise, free consumption. Adam Smith, however, and that's very important, never fully advocated the elimination of government responsibility towards the poor. Now this is significant, because today, when you look at how the neoliberal governments around the world are operating, that's one of the things that they're doing. We have no responsibility towards these people. They failed. This is not necessarily our problem. That was never part of the original idea of liberalism going back to Adam Smith. And in a sense, when you actually get the Great Depression of the 1930s, you have economists like John Maynard Keynes, who theorize that the challenge, came up with theories that challenged liberalism as the best policy, if you will, for capitalists. He said that in essence, full employment is necessary for capitalism to grow, and it can be achieved only through government intervention, the exact opposite, if you will, of what the neoliberals today argue. That in a sense, central banks have to intervene to increase employment. And of course, these ideas were essential in something like the New Deal that I showed you earlier, where FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States at the time, decided that the best way to employ people in a time of economic crisis, in a time of tremendous poverty in the country, and in a time when the banks failed, in a time when you have the Great Depression, is for the state to be the main employer of many of these people. This, in a sense, is what gave rise to the term Keynesianism. It comes from John Maynard Keynes, if you will. Although neoliberalism was an old idea espoused by by such theorists as the economists later Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek, the term itself was literally introduced in the 1980s and was actually considered somewhat successful, ironically, under dictatorial regimes. One of the most successful places in which basically you took the economy of a country that was in dire shape and supposedly neoliberalism rejuvenated it was under Augusto Pinochet in Chile. This was a case in which basically the term itself started to lose some of its negative connotations through this free market opening that happened. The discourse actually continues today with economists like Max Boot and even Niall Ferguson. One of you was asking me about Niall Ferguson. He is the guy who actually advocates that one of the best things that happened to the Third World was colonialism. That in a sense, empire was not a bad thing after all. It's empire that brought countries like India into existence. Many of these people who, in this case, actually replaced the old liberal imperialism with an argument that has to do with that globalization is equal to economic growth, is equal to democracy, with, of course, the argument that empire had resulted in economic prosperity and modernization, as well as the rule of law that did not exist in many countries that were under colonialism. Empire then is seen as this combination of nobility and profit. A very complicated argument that, unfortunately, we in planning cannot completely escape. So I want to move here to talk a bit about globalization as a way of grounding this entire discussion. With all of the talk about globalization, the interconnected world in which we live is actually still constituted of national societies, and the conditions of the identification of individual and collective selves is becoming actually more complex. Any theory of globalization must start with charting this historical and unequal condition under which traditional societies, third world societies, were actually colonized and changed over time. I have actually suggested in some of my work a number of phases, and I described only two of them early on that I told you about. But I think we need to recognize here that in the era of globalization, where culture is becoming increasingly placeless, culture is becoming increasingly placeless. What does this mean? That you have international cultures now that almost exist everywhere and cannot be located within only one particular site. Urbanism, what we do as planners, what we guide as planners, what we see and try to discipline as planners, is also becoming very difficult to maintain. It will maintain some relevance indeed. I think that it will still not surrender to cyberspace. With all of the stuff that is happening in the internet, at the end of the day, you would still need physical spaces that correspond to whatever it is that is going on in the social media. And in a sense, it is precisely within these local spaces that we can see how global domination is influenced, is mediated, or even sometimes generated by global struggles that occur at the village level, at the city level, at the neighborhood level. At the heart of this discussion, of course, is the issue of identity. And you guys here in Amritsar seem to be totally consumed with issues of identity. Of course, the connection between the identity of a people and the form and culture of the urbanism or the cities that they produce has always been the subject of much research. That's not necessarily new. Family, ethnicity, religion, language, and history have all been considered identity constituting elements that are normally handed down, if you will, from one generation to another under this term that we call tradition. However, to cast the traditional, which I think is something you ought to be familiar with as well, to cast the traditional as pure and the modern as corrupt is a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake. And it's actually naive, or even vice versa. that the modern, may be the thing that is new and hence is nascent and is clean. In fact, as much research has demonstrated, and I showed you that earlier, many of these terms that we often use, the South and the North, or the core and the periphery, are invented terms. I would argue that an approach that takes into account the discursive constitution of cultures would recognize that all societies are constructed in a relationship to one another. One does not necessarily see one's identity as an Indian, simply being an Indian, but one is actually seeing it vis-a-vis something else. Here in Amritsar, particularly having seen the sort of the border situation and what happens with the guards and the thousands of people who go and watch it from the Indian as well as the Pakistani side, it reminds me very, very much of how is it that Indian identity, maybe at this particular moment in time, is very much tied with the existence of the other country on the other side. So in looking at the historical phases that I presented to you, I spoke a bit about the pre-industrial period and I spoke a bit about the colonial period and to some extent the era of independence, although I did not highlight that. But that's the era of independence and independence struggle, and then the rise of the nation state is very important as a third phase, and then the fourth phase is the phase that we're in right now, which is globalization. For me, these four phases have always corresponded to also four urban conditions, four city conditions. The indigenous vernacular that we always attribute to the native people or the early people or the people who were always there, the hybrid, which often emerges during conditions of colonialism, the modern and the pseudo-modern and whatever it is that you want to call it that emerges when the nation state is trying to establish itself, and as Karen showed this morning as well, the postmodern, which in a sense corresponds more to the era of globalization. So when the people of the dominated societies actually started to rebel against this colonial world order, they had very little to cling to in their drive to establish their own sovereignty other than the terms of the existing order that was left for them by the colonial rulers with its baggage of social realities. And that, in fact, included things, for example, like the concept of the nation state, which, as I talked about earlier, is an invention, a 19th century invention in Europe that was then transported to or exported to many parts of the world. Groups of people living in one region under a colonial power, possibly having only one thing in common, which is a colonial history, but belonging to different religions, languages, ethnicities, or traditions, had to band together to supposedly achieve this more advanced stage of independence. The few commonalities between them were highlighted by the political bodies, while the differences were suppressed in pursuit of this larger, noble goal of freedom and independence. A national identity based on short-term political interest and the ideologies of struggle actually emerged as the driving force behind most of these nationalistic movements. If you look at even the debates between Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah at that very specific moment, which gave rise to both of these countries, India and Pakistan, this becomes extremely true. But interesting enough, once independence was achieved, the glue that bond together these various groups no longer was pervasive. And in fact, indeed, the events of the 70s and 80s and even all the way to the 90s, with the collapse of many countries, like Pakistan, there was an East Pakistan and a West Pakistan. But suddenly, the Bengalis in what is today Bangladesh have simply decided that, no, we're different. We're not Pakistanis. We are Bengalis, and they wanted to have their own state. And then, of course, you can see that with the collapse of countries like Czechoslovakia, the former republics of the Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, and today, countries like Iraq and countries like Syria are a testament, in fact, to the true association of these people, where tribe, ethnicity, race, religion, sect, or even sometimes language are the prime definers of their collective identity. By the way, this is not necessarily a third world problem or only a third world problem. As you may have heard, I mean, the bigger thing that is going on right now in Europe is Catalonia. Catalonia wants to be independent of Spain. And in fact, if Catalonia becomes independent of Spain, then the Basque would insist on being independent of Spain. The Northern League in Italy believes that Lombardia should not be part of Italy. Is the world going to be divided more and more and more? Yes, I absolutely predict that, and I think it's almost inevitable. Now, what this does to us in planning is that it complicates our unit of analysis. Who are we designing for? We're not designing for the nation anymore. So are we designing only for the neighborhood? And what does that mean if we're only designing for the neighborhood that is constituted of people, of this amalgam of ethnicities and religions and languages, in a sense? So urbanistically speaking, this third world, or this third phase of independence and nationalism, did not really immediately change the conditions of cities in the developing world. Despite the era of colonialism, important and irreversible decisions about the production of the built environment were actually taken during that time and institutionalized. I actually showed this map, which has to do with sort of the master planner, someone like Robert Moses. And in each and every country, there was a Moses. In each and every city, there was a Moses at one point in time who erased parts of the town and be able to do something with it. But my point here is that sometimes you find yourself in situations where things change. So this is a very good example that comes from Saudi Arabia. The image to your right the image to your left is in fact the old quarter of the city of Riyadh, with the very intricate courtyard houses, the cavernous streets that exist within it, and then the one that you have on the right actually represents what ironically happened when the Saudis decided to adopt a building code that insisted on setbacks. So suddenly, what you ended up with are, these empty spaces for a country that valued privacy very much, that were not at all appropriate either for culture, nor were they even appropriate for climate. When I first saw this lighting pole coming out of this apartment building in Al Khobar, Saudi Arabia, I have to say I thought this is very interesting postmodern architecture. When I looked at it very carefully, I actually discovered it was not that at all. In fact, this is a situation where the indigenous population in this case was not necessarily fully aware of how to deal with or how to manage situations of this sort. Later I actually found out that these common infringements on public property were occurring in many parts of these countries, because in the traditional culture people were used to a more fluid relationship with the public realm, allowing them to take it over without necessarily violating it. So, this resident was building his apartment building. He encountered this lighting post. He just simply included it in his balcony. Of course, you can see the one to the right is even more egregious because it is incorporated inside the bedroom. Although I have to say, again, I went out and knocked at the door of this particular person in a very conservative country. But he was nice. He allowed me to actually see what happened. And inside, they had just simply painted this particular lighting pole red and made it into light that, in fact, they were not necessarily even paying for, because it was government light. It was provided to them for free. And of course, with the kinds of things that happen to public housing that I showed you in places like the United States and Egypt and Iran, public housing was the obsession with modernity, which accompanied the early years of nationalism and independence, was characteristic of most third world countries. You created an entire bureaucracy that was based on providing these kinds of services for individuals. So in a sense, you can find lineages of sort of global practices even during that time of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Now, the problem of national identity is further complicated by the global extensive economic exchange that exists today. Not only do nations have to mediate between pre-colonial and colonial legacies, between traditional and modern, but they also must deal with the effect of globalization on the new world order in which they exist. I refer here to globalization as that fourth phase, as the process by which the world is becoming one economic entity, characterized by its informational interconnected modes of production and exchange, and its transnational flows of labor and capital under a predominantly neoliberal capitalist world system. During the era of globalization, the reconstruction of identity becomes paramount, because once independence was achieved, the problems that allowed all of these communities to get together no longer was as strong. And in a sense, very often, this resulted in fundamental conflicts between people within the same country and within the same community. Now here, and in relationship to culture, I would venture to suggest to you that in all of us, as individuals, and as even communities, and possibly even as nations, that there are two conflicting sentiments. In the first, we resort to culture and tradition out of fear of change, a change that in and of itself is inevitable. In the first one, when we resort to this, thing out of fear of change, protectionism against the unknown can, however, turn to fundamentalism. And here we have to be very careful, because do we support the sentiments that individuals may have within certain communities, even if the ultimate effect would be that they distance themselves from others? The second sentiment, on the other hand, is characterized often by the exact opposite, by an interest in the culture of the mysterious other, someone else, either the people on the other side of the border, or the people on the other side of the world, or the people who speak a different kind of language. And it emerges from a totally different feeling, the desire to have a choice, the desire, because tradition is about lack of choice. So this is about the desire to have a choice, to merge with the other, to share in a wider and a different collective consciousness. So the tremendous movement of citizens across borders and the rise of protected ethnic minorities all over the world demonstrate that these two sentiments are both legitimate, and they're not necessarily even contradictory. In fact, sometimes they happen simultaneously or alternatively based on time or place. Much of my own work has been in this very specific arena. So these are two books of mine, one that was actually produced in the late 90s, and the other one was produced at the beginning of the 21st century. In one, Consuming Tradition, Manufacturing Heritage, I employed the lens of tourism, which I think is extremely important for you now in Amritsar, as it is undergoing this massive influx of tourists. I employed that lens of tourism to problematize many of the assumptions regarding heritage and tradition in an attempt to understand how built environments are often packaged and sold in an increasingly global economy of image consumption. In the end of tradition, which actually corresponded to the end of a millennium and the beginning of a new one, I argued that we have reached the end of tradition too. And by this I actually meant the end of our conception of tradition. Not the end of tradition itself, but the end of our conception of tradition as a repository of authentic and hence valuable ideas that have been handed down from one generation to another. So in this era of globalization, nations find themselves having to compete in an ever-tightening global economy, and they find themselves needing to exploit their cultural heritage, as indeed you do here in Amritsar, to attract international investors, tourists that are domestic and local and international as well. Tourism development has consequently intensified, producing entire communities that cater almost wholly to or are even inhabited year-round in some places by the other. The new norm appears to be the outright manufacture of heritage coupled with the active consumption of tradition. It is important to try to understand here how global consumers, some of whom may in fact even visit your city, seek difference and hospitality as economic goods, and how producers, often local people who are suppliers, often in many third world countries, make their living catering to this very specific demand. So in looking at the heritage discourse in the first and third world, one may actually notice that while both, the first and the third world, possibly possess equal desire to explore the heritage, culture, and the products of the other, they have fundamentally different motivations for wanting to do so. These differences may be attributed or explained by earlier relationships of colonialism, political dominance, and economic dependency. Today, as a result of such historical and economic forces, third world countries often wish to emulate the progress of the first world and adopt its developmental practices, but only without risking the destabilization of their local cultures, which is not an easy formula, if you will. This is clearly a situation of wanting to have one's cake and eating it too. Thus, as Benjamin Barber points out in his appropriately titled book, Jihad versus Macworld, many nations want the traditions of the Veil, but they also want Coca-Cola and the communication technology of the World Wide Web, which in a very strange way is unlikely also to change their local culture. So there is that contradiction. So you allow social media, but at the same time you restrict social media. You allowed it, but then you want to do it according to your own thing. China is an excellent example of that. You cannot have Facebook in China. So they create their own Facebook. You cannot have Twitter in China. They create their own Twitter. You can talk to other Chinese people, but you cannot talk to the rest of the world. Yet it's also often the case that first world organizations, foundations, and governments have engaged in precisely some of these efforts of restricting some of these things while condemning or rejecting much of the social and political practices of the societies whose traditions they either claim they want to preserve or claim they enjoy as tourists, especially when these diverge from Western standards of human rights, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. Here, the example of the destruction of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya by Hindu fundamentalists, for me, is a case that sort of pulls together or shows how cultures pull us in contradictory and conflictual ways. You know the story of this, so I'm not necessarily going to harp over it, but it also brings about the need to assess. So what do we do with historic sites that are contested, that one can claim, oh, belong to Hinduism before they belong to Islam, or belong to Islam before they belong to Christianity, so on and so forth. I want you to imagine, instead of looking at the Babri Masjid, looking at something like the Dome of the Rock, which seems to now be accepted as being built on top of the Temple Mount, which is the holiest site of Jewish culture and of Jewish tradition. Would one then destroy it so as to be able to archaeologically dig in and expose, if you will, the Temple Mount? So let me move to the second part of my lecture. I know that we're running out of time, and I know that Sakshi wants me to finish exactly at 3, so I'm really racing. I'm not even half through my lecture. And address the second concern that I have, which has to do with the role of heritage in planning. Today, and speaking globally, one may distinguish between 3 types of places that are being produced with the planned intent, if you will, of making them places for the representation of the cultural tradition of others. I'm actually deliberately showing you here the headquarters of Disneyland. This is the headquarters of Disneyland in Orlando, Florida. You know, a very interesting architectural building designed by a Japanese architect, Tadeo Ando, which actually has, it's an interesting building in and of itself. I'm only showing it to sort of show the displacement of culture altogether. The first type of these kinds of environments is what I actually have called in some of my own books, dream landscapes that replicate historical settings based on the notion of using history to create a Wizard of Oz-like place where all conflicts in a given culture are resolved and where all cultural aspects are simply reduced to their basic representations. In such a vision, all icons of culture, such as architectural style, building typology, spatial configurations, become the cultures that they are supposed to represent. Disneyland here is a very good example. What you're looking at is not the Piazza San Marco. This is, in fact, the Campanile that exists in Disneyland in California, in Anaheim, California, not actually the one that exists in Florida, because there are 2 of them, at least in the United States, and there are many other elsewhere. Now, there's also another second type, which is also important. Places which use history, but which have a legitimate claim to an authentic past. The attempt to resuscitate such places, which sometimes may be entire cities, by making them in their former image, may serve 1 or 2 primary motives: to attract tourists for financial gain, but at the same time also to serve as memory banks for national memory against change. You exist in this second category, you know, whatever it is that is happening in Amritsar in this case. Colonial Williamsburg in the United States is a very good example of that. It is the capital of Revolutionary Era Virginia, and it is America's premier public history site. Yet, like all other history museums, and that's one of the things planners have to be conscious of, to what extent is what they're engaged in is a project of musification, a term that has now become acceptable. So, you know, Colonial Williamsburg has long been criticized by historians for many of the same reasons that we criticize theme parks like Disney. Some critics have even called it an airbrushed, consumer-oriented patriotic shrine, end quote. And there's a reason. There is a reason because when you think about it, this was a site that was only made possible during the colonial era because 2/3 of its residents were slaves. But the housing that the slaves lived in is not there. It disappeared over time. And it's without the slaves that, in a sense, you could not really see how this community functions. So when it was established as this memory site and people started to visit it, you know, people said, but, you know, how does that remind us of the reality of Colonial Williamsburg? So the foundation, which runs it, decided to hire a few African Americans to work in role play as the slaves. Well, it turned out that Americans who were visiting the site were very uncomfortable being reminded of slavery. So in a sense, are you shooting yourself in the foot to make something more realistic, but at the expense of losing the people for whom you're actually engaging in this theatrical performance, if you will? A third example is the city of Santa Fe. in the Southwest, in fact, in New Mexico. Very interesting city where all of the structures that exist in it at one point in time were adobe. Because the town has a very specific, unique identity, the building codes that were generated in the 1960s and 70s required that every single building that is built has to look like it is made of adobe, mud brick houses. But no one builds with adobe anymore. In fact, building codes don't even allow it. So in a sense, you were building wood frame construction, you were building stuff with concrete and giving it the appearance of adobe, actually allowing a group of people to be very critical of Santa Fe. So instead of Santa Fe, which is the name of the town, many people started to call it Santa Fake. And this was interesting. Now in this regard, one might contrast this fake authenticity of Santa Fe with what I will show you in a few minutes, which is what I would actually call the authentic fakery of Las Vegas. The fake authenticity of Santa Fe with the authentic fakery of Las Vegas. Because Las Vegas is particularly a place that is completely fake, but its reality is in its fakery. A third type, which constitutes also the attempt to create nostalgic places, planning. All of this is planning. That exploit cultural heritage in an attempt to normalize it for everyday life. This is, if you will, like the garage that you have outside of the area of the Golden Temple, which in a sense looks like it is something that has been imported from Jaipur. Yet it's a garage. And in a sense, everything around gives the impression of another place. So these are nostalgic places that exploit cultural heritage in an attempt to normalize it for everyday life. The town of Poundbury, in this case that I'm showing you, which originated in fact with Prince Charles's fight with the British architectural establishment, is a very good example of that. It's a traditional village that was designed by Leon Creer, built on land that was owned by the prince. It was an attempt to create a feeling of community that has grown over time. Of course, the desired effect here includes a long stopover in the golden age of 18th century and 19th century Britain before the advent of modernism. All the services, telephone, electric lines, drainage, the big satellite, anything that has to do with the internet, are all hidden, and all that is visible protruding from a roof of a Poundbury house is a stately brick chimney or a polished weather vane. In fact, the town is very much derided by architectural critics as a kitschy time warp. But despite this sentimental pastiche of outmoded styles and small town concepts, it still had increasingly gained favor with the people who live in it, and even with some backpackers and some writers. In fact, as one commentator pointed out, describing Poundbury, the effect is polite, elegant, and as English as a vicar's tea party, end quote. Completely captures that essence. It looks like it has been around since the 18th and 19th century, but in reality, it was actually built in the 1980s. So to go beyond all of these, which for me typify the modernist engagement with heritage and tradition in the era of globalization, we find ourselves confronting two different articulations or different moments. I call these hyper-traditions and post-traditions. And I think for those of us in the arena of studying the built environment and studying heritage, the far-reaching transformation that has been brought about by globalization requires not only calibration of the idea of tradition, but also a substantial repositioning of it. So I use the term hyper here to refer to the social and cultural realms created and maintained through contemporary technologies of communication and information transfer that have radically transformed our notions of time and space. The hyper entails simulation. Here, the map that precedes the territory to which it refers, hence the map effectively creates the territory in reality. So for me, one of the very good examples of hyper environments is the city of Las Vegas, a casino town where the claim to history is non-existent. It is in such places that the loosening of the ties between the sign of a culture and the referent may be the most apparent. Quite simply, to optimize the desire to produce of the producers to manufacture cultural heritage that can be consumed by people and for the tourists to consume it, it becomes common for both groups to simply dispense with any pretense to reality or authenticity altogether. I'm showing you here the Eiffel Tower that exists in Vegas, which is actually exactly half the size of the Eiffel Tower that exists in Paris. But why am I showing it? To remind you that the number of visitors who go to the Eiffel Tower in Vegas is 4 times the number of visitors who go to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. How did that happen? It happened for a variety of reasons. Americans tell you, you know, I live in Nevada, or I live in Arizona, or I live in Oklahoma. It's much cheaper to go there. I also go there and I gamble, so I may even make some money. I go there and I have kind of services that are there that are not available to me in Paris. And furthermore, I go there and I am still with people who are actually like me, not the snooty French who are going to treat me badly because I'm an American. So it's this entire package that has sort of displaced this relationship. Now, so while the real Doge's Palace, which as you know exists in the real Venice and exists on the San Marco Piazza, its equivalent is in fact, it was a seat of government in Venice. And its equivalent here is a major gambling casino called the Venetian. In fact, as I show you both of these, sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish which is the copy and which is the real. The real actually is the one below, but the irony is that the copy is so perfect, and in this case it is done to scale 1:1, that the quality of photographs that you get from it is even better than what you would see in Venice. Similarly, the Rialto Bridge, which was once the only crossing over the Grand Canal in Venice, connects 2 very powerful gambling institutions in this case. So Hyper Las Vegas is the ultimate simulacra, a safe place for the consumption and heritage of the other. Yet before trying to dismiss, you're looking here at New York, which is, again, one of these major sites in Vegas. Before we dismiss such places as kitsch, one must consider that in Las Vegas there's no hidden agenda. Las Vegas presents an outright manufactured heritage based on the concept of copying the traditional forms of everywhere for the consumption of everyone who can afford it. In Las Vegas, the local and the exotic are torn out of place and time to be repackaged, if you will, for the world bazaar. And this leads me to my last concept, which is that of post-tradition. The changes that the world has encountered have occurred against a backdrop of an ever-changing frame of reference. The idea of a global world was predicated on the promise of widespread prosperity, of economic globalization, and the belief that this prosperity went hand in hand with the fruits of liberal democracy. The betrayal of these promises, however, is evident in growing inequalities, increased poverty. And in fact, this was very interestingly captured, if you will, originally in this book, a very important book by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History and the Last Man. This was the view at the end of the 20th century, and then at the beginning of the 20th century, this happens. Some see the events of 9/11 as a symbol of the failure of globalization and the triumph of local frustration that it engendered. Indeed, the euphoric idea of global freedom has been now replaced by the very threat posed by globally unbounded and restrained others, those that we today call terrorists. It is important to recognize that the post-9/11 era witnessed also the rise of a new paradigm, one that some have called, and I contribute to that school, the after-global. Not because we abandon globalization, but because we need to move beyond its limitations. It is after-global because it supersedes the developmental era of multiculturalism and replaces it with the concept of unilateral dominant culture. It is not an end of globalization, but rather the emergence of a different form of engagement that is sharply at odds with this liberal vision of multiculturalism. Hence, both religious fundamentalism and imperial hegemony begin to emerge as the new forms of global engagement today. And, you know, religious fundamentalism represented with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, if you will, and imperial hegemony representing with George W. Bush's response with the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, one common way to describe the post-9/11 era is that of a clash of civilization, which is the collision, if you will, of 2 separate and essentially different worlds. I don't necessarily subscribe to this view. In fact, I subscribe to the other view that is advocated by Tariq Ali, who's actually originally Indian, that reframes this mainstream idea by drawing attention to what he calls a clash of fundamentalisms, a clash between market fundamentalisms and religious fundamentalisms. He actually, in a sense, takes us a further step to talk about how the two are mutually constituted. I actually think that that is very much the case in India with the BJP government. no doubt about it. The religious fundamentalism of the BJP is also a market fundamentalism. A similar idea, of course, is also expressed in Timothy Mitchell's great term, which was a major paper that he wrote, which he called Mac Jihad. It's the jihad that actually uses all of the capacities that we now have of social media and the internet and Macworld. Mitchell argues that we live in an age in which the mechanisms of capital operate in certain critical instances only by adopting the social forces and the moral authority, in this case, of conservative movements. It is, in fact, part of the reason that we have some of the current ideological battles in the world today. Now, identity in this after-global era becomes increasingly complex, and the connection between identity and place is no longer determined by heritage or tradition. Unlike neo-traditional settings, such as Poundbury, which I showed you, or simulated traditional places like Las Vegas, cities such as Hong Kong and Dubai may be considered post-traditional places. They are places that have acquired a global imageability that is based on precedents drawn from elsewhere, and not necessarily from the context in which they exist. They are places that are in constant trace, whose history, one may argue, is always the current present. Whatever it is that exists today is history, because tomorrow there will be something different. In fact, you're looking here at the Dubai skyline. All this emphasis on the re-evaluation of tradition, its role in the production of environments, its demise in the face of globalization, all suggest, if you will, its possible end. And if tradition is merely the dialectic fabrication of modernity, then does not the end of tradition as a meaningful object of inquiry also suggest the end of tradition as an objective reality? The post-traditional environments, and I'm showing you something here that is again very provocative. This is Palm Island. It's not just an island, it's a series of houses, each of which almost exists as an island of itself, built into the Gulf by the Emir of Dubai in this case. It cannot be seen except from an airplane, but it can clearly be seen from the moon. So the question is, why do you want to design something whose only shape can be experienced from the moon? Because it's a stamp. It's a stamp that maybe for an alien group of people who will come to Earth 100 years from now and would say, look, the Arabs actually had palm trees and they made something in the shape of a palm tree. When you reflect on what we sometimes teach in architectural history and what we try to understand it for, you recognize that these symbols are extremely powerful. So Dubai and its Palm Island are an excellent example that stands at the intersection of the post-traditional condition with this, what I call the after-global era. These post-traditional environments are not simply places of mimicry, authentically fake simulacra. They are places where the reference ceases to exist as a fixed moment in history related to place or nation and becomes instead a constantly moving target that legitimizes current actions and even current aesthetics. The connection to both history and geography is severed, and hence historical and vernacular styles become irrelevant or relics of the past. Now, this is very sad for us as planners, because often the tools that we use are very much anchored in this very specific realm. The impact on urbanism is that cultural experience may likely become less place-rooted and more informationally based. I'm going to repeat that because this actually, for me, captures the main dilemma that we are faced with today. That cultural experience is likely to become less place-rooted and more informationally based. Manuel Castells, and I think Kieran also mentioned that, in his beautiful trilogy, The Network Society, has argued about what he calls the space of flows that has replaced the space of places. And his argument for planning is very cogent and very relevant. Now, I have actually explored this very specific phenomenon in one of my latest books, which was published in 2014, in which I talked about, the real, the hyper, and the virtual interbuilt environment. And my argument was that authenticity can no longer be the definer of tradition. We, unfortunately, in architecture and planning, have to give up that. I argued that what lasts in tradition today, whether we like it or not, is the fleeting, the transient, and the contingent. I would like to end this lecture and actually end this course, if you will, with a few illustrations of this idea. I'm going to return back to Disneyland and its main street. So Disney, if you ever visit Disneyland or Euro Disney or Disney World or even Disney Tokyo, all of them have American themes, but they also sometimes have local themes. But the most American of all themes that they have is this thing called Main Street. You see actually a photograph of it below. It's a street that in fact was produced by Walt Disney and Harper Goff, who was the first director of Disney World, based on the small towns in America that they grew up in. They took elements. They actually took photographs of the streets that were important in their town, and they constituted this Main Street America. So the two towns that actually inspired Main Street were Marsland in Colorado and Fort Collins in Missouri. Both of these towns encountered major difficulties in the 80s and the 90s, economic difficulties, as you know, America was encountering economic difficulties. They didn't really know exactly what to do. So they went to the Disney Corporation and they asked the Disney Corporation for help. You guys copied some of our buildings, can you help us? And you know, this is not completely unusual. So for example, the Venetian that I told you about, this hotel casino in Vegas, gives 0.1%, very little, but 0.1% of all of its profit to the city of Venice. And it does that, although Venice is not copyrighted or patented as an environment. But they do that because their connection to Venice is what allowed them to exist. It is to their advantage to have a Venice and to claim that they are a copy of Venice. Because if Venice itself were not to exist anymore, they won't have the same kind of power, if you will, of giving this kind of an experience. So these two towns actually go to Disney, and Disney decides, okay, we're going to help. So what do? The first is they change the names of the streets in the original towns to call it Main Street, even though the original streets were not called Main Street, but now they were called Main Street USA. Why? Replicating what Disney has. And they copy some of the changes that Disney has made, and they copy it in the actual town itself. This is a case, if you will, where the fake copy or the replica becomes the instrument by which the original can now be brought back to life. It's as simple as that. If there's a copy and the original is like disappearing, something is happening to it, so the copy is there and we can actually use the copy to substitute, if you will, for the original. The second example actually does not come from the built environment, but for me it is very cogent. In December of 2010, the United States Postal Service issued a standard stamp featuring the most distinctive, if not the world's most recognized American symbol, if you will, the Statue of Liberty, on the stamp. As part of the stamp's release, the Postal Service provided a brief history of Lady Liberty and made the obligatory remarks on the statue's value as a symbol of political freedom and democracy for millions of people. A few months later, a philatelist, those are the people who study stamps and collect stamps and are experts on stamps, discovered that the image of this on the stamp itself was not of the original Statue of Liberty in New York, but rather was of the Statue of Liberty in Las Vegas, the copy. And you can actually see, if I again show you these, you wouldn't necessarily know which one is, but you know, the real one is the one to the right, that's New York. The one to the left is actually Las Vegas, and it's in front of the casino and hotel, which is called New York, New York. Of course, what had happened here is that in response to this very specific thing, the Postal Service was actually very confused. They didn't know what to do, but they had printed already 1 billion stamps. They're not going to remove them from the market. So they didn't know what to do. So they came up with a justification on their website. They said, okay, if you look very carefully, we didn't say this is the Statue of Liberty. We said it's Lady Liberty. So you can actually consider that this is a Statue of Liberty, not the Statue of Liberty. And then they went on to explain that the reason, and I'm going to show you that again here, is that if you really look at it, the one that we did, the real stamp, which you actually see here on the side, they said that the ear of Lady Liberty in New York has completely disintegrated, while the ear of Lady Liberty in Las Vegas is quite good. So it's better to show something that maybe looked like what Lady Liberty was like, not before. Now, so the last example that I'm actually going to give you is one that I already talked about, and it has to do again with one of these conferences that I organized back in Cairo, in fact, in 1998. So as one of the IASTI conferences, these are the conferences of the International Association for the Study of Traditional Environments, an association that I was part of and helped found back in 1987. So it's been around for 30 years. During that time, we had one of the conferences in 1998, so almost 10 years after it was established, in Cairo, Egypt. Of course, when you have a lot of people who are coming to a conference like that, what do? They go to the sites. And like I have been to all of the sites here. They are tourists. So I accompanied them, and there were like maybe 200 of them. And then I heard this guy looking at the Sphinx. The Sphinx exists in a pit right next to the Great Pyramids. And his comment was, "Oh my God, it is so small, it is so small." I was completely surprised. Why the hell is the Sphinx small? What happened? How could it have become small? It didn't shrink. I went and looked at the guy's name tag. You know, we all have name tags when we attend conferences. And, you know, it turned out that he is a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, which has actually a school of architecture. His school was right next to the Pyramid, which is actually a major hotel in Las Vegas called the Luxor Hotel, which has a Sphinx in front of it. But because the Sphinx acts as the entrance to the hotel, and because America is a big country with big cars and big people, it had 6 lanes. So the Sphinx had to just be twice the size of the Giza Sphinx. So the poor guy, seeing that Sphinx every day, sees the real Sphinx and he's disappointed. Why? Because the real Sphinx did not live up to the reality of its copy. And just that very specific aspect of it was sort of sufficient to completely change, his appreciation of it. Now, I think what is really important for us to recognize here is that along the way, in this very specific example, the reality ceased to be relevant when the image became the principal frame of reference. Or as Baudrillard, one of the French philosophers who actually talks about this substantially, simulation is no longer a referential being or a substance. It is the generation of models of a real without origin or reality altogether. And as a way of ending this course, I will only remind you that it's always only in context that we have any reality at all. Thank you very much. And I think we stayed on time, so that's very good. And we can, I don't know if the ceremonies that are planned are going to happen, but can we get the lights, please? And if there's a few minutes that you still want to engage me in discussions, I don't know if we have the time, but I would be very glad to do so. Can we get the lights, please, on both sides? Yes. You're exhausted after 5 days, I know. But I'm exhausted too, you know? Because you have to remember that even though I'm still out of this vicinity, I was very fortunate yesterday that Raul took me to the Golden Temple, and I entered the Golden Temple at 7 o'clock, 7:30 in the morning. An amazing experience which I will never forget. So I've been waking up until 30 in the morning every day. Any questions? Anything? Yes? So
this is actually a question about your earlier experience.
That's okay.
So can you talk about the conflict between the informal sector workers and formal sector housing? So the state, you said that the state never actually tried to be a formal sector housing, informal sector workers in formal sector housing, and that state schools would actually be
Yes.
That is primarily because it's a semi-authoritarian state.
That's partly correct, yes. My point was that to qualify for any kind of state support, as you apparently now have in India, as I learned with the new cards, that the biometric cards or whatever it is that allow the state to know everything about you, that normally you need some form of formalization to be able to enter this formal economy. Getting housing from the state, taking grant and what have you, require this set of documents or this kind of a job or this security of employment or what have you. The Singapore government was one of the few that never insisted on that. And I don't know if that was the case partly because of culture or it was the case as a deliberate strategy, but what we know is that they allowed the transformation of many of the hawkers. You also have to remember that Singapore engaged in a brutal urban renewal program that removed the shop houses. So the shop houses many of the shop houses were informal. So in the process of removing those shop houses that were informal, they took care partly of some of those people in the informal economy who were allowed then to move to other places. But despite their informality, in spite of the fact that they don't have stable incomes and they don't have provable incomes, they were still given access to public housing. Of course, the tragedy of Singapore, in a sense, is that after they removed quite a lot of the shop houses from the downtown, they recognized that they have demolished the thing that the tourists come to. So they came back, and in a particular area of Singapore, they used the photographs of the shop houses that they demolished to rebuild those shop houses in the same area. Anything else?
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it's something not related directly with this topic, and just want to take your view on with how we can, remove the obstacles which we are facing in India between the politics and the planning actually. Because many of the things are not achievable because there is a contradiction between the both areas. We are not able to, maybe convince the politicians, or maybe the Amritsar case. On the Sakshi ma'am has given the presentation that when that area around the Golden Temple, when that idea was conceived, so maybe there was no role of much of planners actually.
Yes.
That is why we can see the result.
Yes.
So I just want to take your view on it, how we can.
Yes. Yeah, it's a very, very good question. It's a question I always get in Berkeley all the time, because a lot of my lectures are unfortunately about the failures of planning and not necessarily about its successes. And it's not because there are no successes of planning, but there are. But the successes of planning, unfortunately, often exist either at the micro scale or at the very macro scale, and not the stuff that is, in a sense, in between. I advocate 3 roles for planners as an escape from that dilemma. The planner as a social activist. So you abandon planning, physical planning or social planning or what have you, and you simply be an agitator in a community. Operates within non-governmental, or in the United States what we call non-profit organizations. Now, this requires the planner. An architect who ran for office was Jaime Lerner, who in Curitiba in Brazil managed, in fact, this is the first successful BRT ever. It's 30 years old now. And when it got started in Curitiba, it got started under a paradigm that no one ever expected was going to work. Which is what? The city had all of these old buses. That's how it started. Now it's completely different. And these old buses were very similar to the new buses, but they did not function anymore because they aired their engines. So he took the old buses, put them in the stations, asked people to pay in the old bus. The bus itself, the old bus, doesn't have doors anymore. The doors are stripped. The new bus comes, sits next to it, opens the doors, and they go. So basically, it became like almost a subway system, where you have a station, but the station is a bus. That's how he envisioned it, and he envisioned it as an architect again in 1974. So I don't think he would have been able to do anything of the sort had it not been, for this creative speciality. Something else that he also did, which was fantastic. Curitiba has hills, and it was very difficult in the favelas to collect the garbage. The garbage the garbage truck would not go up. Yet Brazil, also as a country that produces a lot of wheat, and it executes some of this wheat so as to make sure that it maintains the price, decides, okay, well, it has an abundance of wheat. He made a deal with the federal government to get wheat tax, and he made this experiment. He said, okay, for those people who have garbage up in the favela, in the hills, we are going to create these chutes they can bring their stuff down, and for every bag of garbage, they get a bag of wheat. It worked very well. One, he managed to get rid of, or he managed to use the surplus that exists in terms of flour, and he created an efficient system, which over time, of course, this problem in Curitiba today has also been solved. So in a sense, there are many ways that planners can still engage. Ultimately, planners have to live with the fact that politicians are always going to be more powerful, that they are people who are in the service of politicians, and if they don't like it, become politicians. There's no other. Okay? One last question?
Sir, as a planner, how much it is justified to blend the historic approaches with the modern approaches of planning?
Okay. I'm not sure I understand exactly. How much is it what?
How much it is justified to blend the historic approaches with the modern
To
approaches
blend
of
them?
Yes.
Very good question. It depends very much on actually what you mean by historic and what you mean by modern. So, if what you mean by historic is the maintenance of particular imagery that is taken from historical sites, I would say this is a prerequisite, because in a very specific society, you need to create things that are more legible to the people. And I'm not necessarily even against fakery. I'm personally not against fakery. So I'm not very much disturbed by the garage in which we park, which basically looks like something that has been imported from Jaipur. I laugh at it. The problem may be that to an Amritsar resident or to a Jaipuri who comes and visits, this may be a bit weird. Why is this here? Why does it look like that? Now, in architecture, we're often taught that buildings are supposed to reflect their form, is supposed to reflect their content and their meaning. But we exist in a global era right now where nothing reflects anything. So everything is completely confused. So we cannot come up with a single societal standard that insists on a form that represents a particular function. So the only thing that I can tell you is there's an issue of ethics here. And the ethics is the individual ethic, not necessarily of the planner, because unfortunately the planner in this case, again, may have to follow a client's wish. So here, and this is the fourth role, which I think is very important for planners to play. And it's not necessarily one that I advocate because I don't believe that planners are informed enough to play it yet. But the planner as an educator. And not necessarily an educator within society or of society, but actually, and most importantly, an educator of the client that is making decisions, who very often is the developer, the contractor, or the politician. In India, I think in your cases, you actually have to always convince the chief minister. Maybe that's the only way you can achieve something as balanced. Okay? Thank you all very much.
Dr. Nazar, we are anyway going to...
Oh, I have to be here, okay?
Yeah, just thank you, Dr. Nazar. May I invite upon our guest of honor, Professor Sumit Singh sir, to please come and occupy his seat on the dais. May I also request Professor Pravinder Singh to please come on the stage. Professor Pravinder Singh, our local... and may I call upon Professor Chehal to please come on the dais. My fellow coordinator Sakshi, please.
Hello. Good to see you again.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all on the valedictory session of GIAN course on Histories of City Planning from 11 to 15 December 2017. I would begin by presenting a brief summary of GIAN, which we conducted during the 5 days course. So actually we covered whole of the time machine, where in the first session on Dr. Nezar took us from the various approaches in history of city planning. He explained very explicitly, wherein he covered how the contemporary is to examine and he also mentioned about the Italian novelist in The Invisible Cities, and he described various phenomena about what is planning, how do we do it, and what is the impact of policies. In the second session that was taken up by myself, I discussed the factors that affect the histories of human settlements and what impact it has on the human settlements. And in the third session, again by Dr. Nizar, he took up the tutorials by explaining. Day 2 was from ancient to medieval cities, in which we went back to 11,000 years and discussed the housing typologies of the city of Ur, its street, housing in different parts of Egypt, ancient lives, introduction of Romans, the Middle Ages were discussed after the fall of Ottoman Empire. Even Dr. Nizar showed us the virtual tour of Egypt, which he made for some American television series. The second session was discussed by me on the medieval cities of India and what its elements are consisting of it, including a traditional Amritsar city. And on day 3, the topic was modern city, and discussion was on planning under the modern city. We discussed the French colonization and Haussmann in Paris. We also discussed the Crystal Palace reassemblance from London to New York, and it was followed by some of the modernization clips, which were quite funny. And we had the tutorials, which were discussed by Dr. Kiran on the utopian concepts of various philosophers and thinkers, and the video of the future of cities. And then different groups did some amazing brainstorming about utopias and the realism. It was actually involving everyone, and the purpose was solved. Everyone was involved in it, and we can see on the walls, the work was tremendous. Day 4 started with urban renewal concepts and its application in India, where the stakeholders' participation is missing in any vision or plan. The second part dealt with the Robert Morse's video and how he was used as a tool by the politicians, which was quite amazing. The tutorial part was again covered by Kiran Sandhu, who showed public participation in various contexts, its applicability and concept of Einstein's ladder of public participation, which was followed by videos of Yamuna Pushta and also recent cut Putli Colony demolition. Again, we had an amazing brainstorming session, which was done by the participants and who assumed themselves in different positions. Today morning session was discussed by Dr. Nizar about from urban renewal to public housing, discussing the cases of Singapore to Egypt and concepts of NIMTO, like Kiran told about NIMBY yesterday. Kiran Sandhu also tried to revise what all we did. She also included many new approaches of planning theories and planning manifestations like neoliberalism in India, disjointed incrementalism. She talked about various approaches like advocacy planning by Paul Davidoff, collaborative and communicative planning approach, and new urbanism, postmodernism, communist planning approaches, and transect ecozones. Then new urbanism critique was discussed, utopia value-based approaches, the spiritual city was discussed, and Enrique Peñalosa was discussed, planning for happiness was discussed, and then in the end we had this 3 types of inherent characteristics by Reichel and Weber. Wicked problems were discussed. And in the last session, which Dr. Nizar took in the afternoon, he explained explicitly about globalization and neoliberalism. He showed some interesting clips about neoliberalism in Saudi Arabia public housing, colonial and modernization and postmodernization, world as one. He also told about world as one global entity. He showed some of his books and his works, The End of Tradition, Consuming Tradition, Manufacturing Heritage. And then he gave a lot of examples, even from India, from Babari Mosque of Ayodhya to role of heritage in planning. He gave examples of Palm Island in Dubai to Disneyland, Vegas, Statue of Liberty in New York and Vegas, Sphinx at Cairo, Egypt and Vegas. And he even explained how these things are being shown in different parts of the world. So I would like to conclude thank you, Dr. Nizar, for contributing, accepting the invitation, and showing us a new dimension of histories of city planning. I'm sure all of us have learned a lot in this time-space journey through the GIAN course on histories of city planning. So I thank you once again for taking out time of your busy schedule and coming out and making us aware of histories for 5 days. It was an exhaustive learning from our side, from the other side of the world. Now, we are honored to have a professor who has been our idol for years, who is also our guest of honor for the session. On stage, please, Professor Sarup Singh. I would like him to come on stage and share with us some of his thoughts on the course. Thank you, sir.
At the outset, I would like to congratulate Ms. Kiran Sandhu and her team for organizing this course on GIAN, and I'm sure her team has managed this course quite brilliantly, as is obvious from what Madam Sakshi has just said about. I'm also sure that Professor Nazar Al-Sayed has given his best to the participants, and at the same time the participants have extracted maximum out of him. And on this account, I think Professor Nazar deserves a big round of applause on this particular account. As I could get from my brief presence in this hall today, a lot has been discussed about the histories of city planning. I'm also attracted to say some words in this particular context, but in the Indian context only. Before 20th centuries, our cities were quite human in their existence and their functioning. But afterwards, the cities have become relatively inhuman, functionally as well as with respect to their outlook. Now, I would like to elaborate this particular statement with the help of two examples, one from Delhi and other from Amritsar only. In the year 1957, Parliament of India came out with a very fine legislation in the name of Delhi Development Act of 1957, which provided for the establishment of Delhi Development Authority for purposes of planned development of city of Delhi. And this act, for the first time in our country, introduced the concept of master plan. And accordingly, master plan for Delhi was prepared in the year 1962 and duly approved by the Parliament of the country. The master plan of 1962 was updated and revised in the year 1981 and then in 2001. In all these three efforts, river Yamuna and its bed was referred to be an area to be conserved as such. Now, to our pleasant surprise, this is not the case. Now, we have plundered the river Yamuna by virtue of various activities induced in that particular area. Now, this area is not a small, this runs into miles in city of Delhi. Now, I will refer only to one example, that is Akshardham. We have put up Akshardham, a spiritual monument in that particular area, which is meant to be conserved like that only. And very recently, this Shri Shri Ravi Shankar is also in picture in spoiling the beauty of that particular area. And National Green Tribunal is after him to recover the damages done to that particular site. Now, this all is because of the indiscipline being, say, practiced by many actors, be it a case of government, administration, the spiritual people, the society, and everybody concerned with a particular area. Now, this ultimately has culminated into a kind of indisciplined city. Now, the other example of indiscipline being observed in our cities is from Amritsar itself. The professional consultants have prepared master plan for Amritsar, which is duly approved by the government of Punjab and is in operation as on date. Now, the indiscipline has been played both by the government as well as the professional planners. Now, I'll quote the example of BRTS. Now, master plan does not mention about this particular say element in the say in the case of Amritsar city. Now, professionals have ignored this particular requirement, and this requirement has been induced by the government on its own. Now, master plan, which is approved, which is legal document, has been set aside by way of putting up this particular project into execution. Now, both are at fault. Both have, you see, presented the case of indiscipline. So, this way, we are adding a lot in the name of indiscipline to create indisciplined cities. Now, the planners, the professionals, the architects, the engineers, I think they have to play a significant role in order to set the things right. Now, the challenge before all of us is to go in for having a disciplined city. Now, how that disciplined city would be achieved, it's a matter to be discussed and decided in various fora. Now, in the end, I would like to again thank the organizers for having invited me to this particular fora for expressing my views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sarup Singh, for sharing and elaborating on BRTS, Amritsar, and Delhi Development Act and Master Plan. Now, I would request from our participants, Dr. Jyoti Pandey Sharma, to share her experiences with us during her stay.
I think I have the liberty to articulate on behalf of all the participants what we all have been through in the last 5 days. So I'd like to begin by thanking Kiran and Sakshi first, sort of being convinced of the fact that histories of any sort, and in this case city planning, histories of any sort, including city planning, are worth talking about for 5 days in the first instance, because normally in this part of the world we normally tend to sidestep history, particularly in the architectural and planning domain. So thank you very much for that. And both of you, I would say, have been tremendously hospitable, kind, very charitable. I was unwell, so I know what you did with me. And you've been very good resource persons, and I think your tutorials were particularly very, very sensitively designed, and I'm sure all of us enjoyed doing that. So thank you very much. On behalf of all the participants, I'd also like to formally thank Dr. Nazar for bringing the world to us here. because he has, at least I can speak for myself, and I'm sure all the other participants will probably echo what I'm saying, that we often tend to be so engrossed in our own academic context that we sometimes fail to make the connections with the larger world. So these 5 days have brought the world to us, thanks to him, for which I think we're all very, very grateful. The reading material, which I happened to go through, I'm not sure how many of us did, is very, very relevant, and I'm sure that we will keep going back to it in our own work. And also, thank you very much for being very patient. We are not necessarily known for our virtue of punctuality, so I've seen how you waited for people to turn up, and we've had days when we've not managed to start on time, and you've had to wait, and I noticed that because I'm a stickler for time myself. So thank you for understanding that we have our little limitations, or call them whatever you like. And I think thank you for the hospitality, the famous Amritsari hospitality. I think we've enjoyed it tremendously. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ma'am Sharma. And I think she has almost covered everything. Yeah. Okay. About the time punctuality especially. Now I would request Dr. Palwinder Singh to speak few words on GIAN completion. So.
The dignitaries on the dais, faculty members and participants. So though I may not be able to comment much on the science that you have discussed in the last 5 days, but certainly from my point of view, I congratulate the organizers for the successful completion of the course, and as I have the views from the participants and discuss with the faculty members, it is really a great success that the efforts Madam Sakshi and Madam Kiran has put in for the last 5 or 6 months. I remember continuously they have followed up. At one time of point, Professor Nazar got some health issues and we have to postpone the program. And again for the new sanction and other letters to the GIAN committee, it was really a tedious job to have this course to come to the completion stage. So really I appreciate their efforts. I must put on record the financial assistance by the Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India for organizing this course. So we are thankful to the ministry for providing all the financial assistance, and I am also thankful to the university authorities for providing all the infrastructure in the form of either it is guest house accommodation, hall, or everything else that was required for the running of this course. So we are thankful to the authorities of Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. So as a local coordinator, I am also thankful once again to Professor Nazar, who has traveled all the way from UC Berkeley to Amritsar and must have given the wonderful information to the participants. We are thankful to you, sir. So I am thankful to all the participants who have attended this course. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Palwinder Singh. I would like to mention on record, without his support, every now and then, every day I was calling him, and he has been tremendous in helping us out at everything, because this was the first course in faculty outside sciences. So I was in fact not knowing anything. So he's the one who's taken us on the ladder that you have to do this, you have to do this. Every day he was mailing, and I am really thankful to Dr. Palwinder Singh for the support he has given to us. Now I would request our Dean Faculty of Physical Planning and Architecture, Dr. Karamjit Singh Chahal, to say a few words on completion of our course. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Nazar Al-Sayed, Professor Swaroop Singh ji, guest of honor of the day, Dr. Palvinder Singh, Madam Kiran, Sakshi. So it's my privilege and honor to present a vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Nazar, who has taken out time from his busy schedule and given us 1 week. I hope we had very insight of the topics related to histories of the city, and hope everybody who has attended this course might have gained a lot from him. He's a person who has a deep inside knowledge of this topic, who has authored many books on this topic. So special thanks to Dr. Nazar, who has really enlightened us during last week, and everybody has gained from his knowledge. Any course is not possible without the hard work. So then special thanks to Madam Kiran and Sakshi, who have put a lot of hard work to make this course a success. They have been working, as Dr. Palvinder has said, from last 6 weeks, 6 months almost. There was a postponement of course. There are many, problems, because there's a lot of red tapeism in a government project. We need to get a lot of approvals, which take a lot of time. So special, thanks to them, who have put a lot of work to make this course a success. Then special thanks to the university authorities also, who have wholeheartedly supported this idea, and they have provided all the infrastructure and funds to arrange this program. So it has been honor to host you all at our campus, although the outside candidates are only limited. Overall number was around 70, and hope in future we'll get more outside participants also, because this type of interaction ultimately becomes a platform where we can interact and we can exchange our views. Then special thanks to the audience also, who have patiently listened to the lectures for last 5 days. Hopefully they will also have a lot of things which they have gained and they will use in their future academic work or their teaching. So thanks all of you to make, who have been who has worked as a team and make this program as a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Faculty, Dr. Karamjeet Singh Chahal. Now I would request Dr. Nazar Al-Sayed, professor himself from University of California, Berkeley, to share his experiences during the course and how he experienced. I know he's been to India many times. How was his experience in this part of the country? So, Dr. Nazar, on stage, please.
I have to say, I'm not necessarily used to all of this formality. I'm delighted to be part of this, ritual, if you will, of closing this activity. As Sakshi just said, I've been in India so many times. In fact, this is my 20th time. I had to count them, because when I asked this question, I couldn't exactly remember. The first time I came to India was in the 1980s. This is a very different country, very, very different country. I can't imagine what Amritsar was like in 1982, which is the first time that I visited Delhi. I'm almost certain it was a very different city. My experience with the city was amazing. My experience with this particular event was also very fruitful. I enjoyed talking to many of you. I enjoyed your questions very much. I'm one of those people, I come originally from the third world. So in a sense, even though I'm a Californian in every single respect, it's the only place in the world which feels to me like home. I've always felt a sense of responsibility towards anyone from the third world who approaches me. So I've taken as much time as I actually could. I hope I did not disappoint any of you. Many of you wanted to speak to me about going to graduate school or about very specific questions that relate to planning practice in the United States, or even about, problems in Amritsar that I have very little context of, but I had to give some advice on, and I worked very hard to offer that when it was possible. I have to also say that I'm not only very grateful to Kiran and Sakshi, not only for the organization, but mainly for the hospitality by which I was definitely treated, but also to all of you. I felt completely familiar and at home. And in a sense, I think we have managed to start a beautiful friendship, if I were to reflect on the famous words from the film Casablanca as a way of ending this event. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you, Dr. Nizar. Now, I would request Dr. Karamjeet Singh Chehel to honor Dr. Nizar Al-Sayed. Thank you, Dr. Nizar. Thank you, Dr. Chehel. Now I would request our head of department, Kiran Sandhu, to honor our guest of honor, Professor Sarup Singh. Thank you, Kiran and Professor Sarup Singh. Now I would request Dean Faculty, Dr. Chehel, to honor our local GIAN coordinator, Dr. Palwinder Singh. Last but not the least, I would request Kiran Sandhu to come and deliver a vote of thanks.
So, before bringing the curtains down, a couple of official thanksgiving to be done. First of all, again, I begin by thanking the dignitaries on the dais. All of them, our guest of honor, Professor Sarup Singh, Dr. Al-Sayed, Dr. Palwinder Singh, Dr. K.S. Chehel. Thank you very much for taking out the time to be here. There is a bit of a list which I should definitely read out to do complete, justice to the event which is just on way to conclusion. To begin with, the GIAN course would never have been possible without the conception of the same by the Ministry of Human Resource Development and by the initiative which they have taken. And so maybe thanks to those unseen people in the ministry who actually made it possible for this event to be conceived and to be materialized in the way it has happened. So we thank those people there, and especially the ministry for the financial support which they have given to us. Next in line, I think we must thank our university. The entire approach has been extremely encouraging from day one. I have to say that from all quarters of the university, we got complete encouragement from the worthy Vice Chancellor to our Dean Academic Affairs, our GIAN coordinator, Palwinder Singh sir. He's been extremely encouraging, and at every stage, I think he has helped us overcome all the barriers which we were facing. So we thank the university authorities, we thank all the departments which have helped us in making this possible. We received incredible help also from our colleague in various ways, all our colleagues in our department. And I thank all of them who happen to be here in the hall. And perhaps one name which I could take definitely is our in charge of hospitality, Mr. Sandhu. He has played an outstanding role. And I think the very fact that we got our warm lunches and steaming teas and coffees, it was because of his efforts. So we definitely thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, everybody, all my worthy colleagues here. Thank you for all your support. Not to forget our colleagues from our sister department, Madam Minakshi, Dua sir, Pankaj sir, Raval Singh ji, for your support. Incredible indeed. Thank you very much, and we'll continue to lean forward and look for your support whenever we do something like this. How can we forget the people sitting in the back, the incredible students. Thank you so much. Our teams have done a stupendous job, I have to say that. The duties they were allocated have been completed to perfection. And I think I have the right now to use that word. Right from the teams who were designated for the medias, led by Ravinder Singh and Ajay, they did a stupendous job out of it. Our finance team, again, led by, if I can see, Sumit and Mohit somewhere. They did a great job. Our logistic support team led by Manish and Vanchul did a fantastic job. And I think, yes, the other teams, the ones who were attached to the hospitality, Hosandeep, Parikshit, Paras, Lavnish, fantastic job again. Arbab with the technical support. So Arbab, Sagar, Nishant, Anuradhan. And if I've missed out a name, I really apologize for that. And you can come back to me later and I'll make up to you, for sure. All right. We were very fortunate to have at least, I would say, 2 outstanding participants from other institutions. And we really thank you, Dr. Nisar Khan, Dr. Jyoti Sharma. I think this interaction has turned out to be really, really engaging and a fruitful interaction. And we look forward to a long association with you as well. GIAN participants from our Faculty of Planning and Architecture. So thank you so much for being here. And I think this session, I mean, particularly the context of histories and planning theory have been really enlightening for you. I must also mention the non-teaching staff from our department. They played a great role, a great supportive role in this initiative. So we must thank them as well. The group from the videography section, led by Mr. Vikrant, sitting on the right. He's been here 5 days. Maybe a round of applause for him as well. Well, possibly last but not the least, I think event of this scale and with a lot of micro details involved would not have been possible without the help of, rather I would say, the course coordinator herself, Madam Sakshi. So Sakshi, thank you very, very much for being one of the most supportive and one of the most, I would say, encouraging coordinators. And I think you've done again a great job. And I think a majority of what we have seen here is attributed to her. A round of applause for her. So if I have missed out anything or anybody, my apologies for that. It is definitely not intentional. I thank you again, all the dignitaries on the dais, all the dignitaries and our august audience sitting in front of us. Thank you so much, and a round of applause to everybody in this hall. Just one quick announcement. The outstation participants will deliver your certificates today, and the other outstation participants, if there are any. The local participants, I think we can do that on Monday, if that's fine, or whenever you like. I mean, if you want it today, then we'll do that, but then for us, it is a little more convenient if we do it in the coming week. So thank you very much indeed, and please join us for tea downstairs before we pull the final curtains. So thank you very much. Thank you.
I very much enjoyed our discussion. Thank you so much.